Thank you, Amy. So as I mentioned at the beginning, it's summer now. I celebrate that. And of course it means that here in the church we're getting ready for all kinds of summer stuff. It's always the time I think we're going to have nothing to do for 2 months, and all of a sudden it's September 1st. One of the things we're getting ready for is Kid Camp. I hope you are saving your 48-ounce peanut butter jars, 8 inches tall, 3 inches wide, clear. Our theme for Kid Camp this year is Camp Firelight. So we're going to fill the whole place with tents and pretend to be away at summer camp with the kids and tell Bible stories around a, not real of course, campfire. And preparing for that, I have to tell you, we've been meeting the last few weeks. It has given me such warm, fuzzy feelings, remembering my own experience sitting around the campfire sharing stories. Like, there's just something really formative about that, right? And I thought, hey, you know what? Why should we let the kids have all the fun? I want a popsicle, and I want to sit around the campfire telling some stories. So I thought maybe, if you were interested, we might spend some of this summer just telling some stories from the Bible that tend to get a little bit less attention. Like, not to throw any shade at the Good Samaritan or anything, but it is true that some stories in the Bible get more airplay than others. And there's a lot of good stuff in this thing. There's a lot of really questionable stuff, but there's a lot of really good stuff. I think we'll have an opportunity to get to both as we go through this summer. So I thought we could just kind of gather around and listen. And maybe some of these are stories you've heard before, or maybe they'll be new. I don't think it really matters. I think these are stories worth telling and worth investigating whether there might be some new inspiration in them for us right now. Does that sound okay? Okay, I'm not sure what I was going to do if you said it didn't, so I'm glad we're on the same page. And the first story I want to tell you, of course, is the story of Esther. Any big Esther fans out there? All right, a couple, great. Yes, this is good. Esther's great. It's a whole book. It's one of only 2 named for women in the whole Bible. Cool. But sadly, if you attend a church that follows a lectionary or a schedule of assigned readings, you will only hear a few verses from Esther once every 3 years on the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, which is not like the biggest, most important liturgical holiday we've got. So I thought we'd spend some time with Esther this morning, especially because it's also a great story for Pride Month. It's also, fun trivia fact, one of 2 books in the Bible that don't mention God at all. How'd they get in there? We don't know. Do you know what the other one is? The Song of Songs. Interesting. We'll visit that later. Spoiler alert. Okay, so Esther. And if you're looking in your Bibles, this comes after Ezra and Nehemiah, right before Job and Psalms. So you fold it in half, you open it in the middle, and then go back, a little bit. And it starts with a king. His name is Ahasuerus, which is just too hard to say, so let's just call him the king. And this king is living about 500 BCE in the time after the Jews were in exile. And this particular king was the king of Persia. So that's the background you need. And you'll know one day the king decided to host a party for no other reason than to show off what a rich king he was, which is apparently what you do when you're a king, by the way, in case you ever find yourselves in that predicament. You think, I just don't know how to inhabit this role. Throw a party to show how rich you are. So the king invited this whole city to his banquet, and it was a lavish affair, like the bring out the finest linens, grandma's china kind of thing. And it was said there was no end to the food or to the wine. In fact, the scripture says drinking was by flagons and without restraint. What a party. And that was just for the men, right? The women kind of had their own party. I don't know if they had flagons or not. I'm going to assume they did. So the men are partying and the women are partying, and they're all just so glad the king is so rich, right? Well, maybe not, but they're pretending they are. And everything's going really well. That wasn't until the 7th day when the king decided to summon his wife Vashti, the queen, to his banquet to show her off as part of his many riches. Okay, so this was a time when your wife was your property, and so on display along with your Ferrari or what have you, right? Things that you own. So the king said, Vashti, wear your crown and come show off your beauty to my guests. But Vashti did not do that. Is the sort of driving problem that starts the story. Many scholars have speculated about why this was, several identifying a subtext in the story, which is that by wear your crown, the king meant only the crown. And it was such an embarrassing invitation to Vashti that she refused. But for whatever reason, she didn't come, and this made the king very angry. And so he consulted with some of his advisors, but they were no comfort to him because they alerted him to an even bigger problem than his sort of intermarital conflict. Vashti, they said, has not only done wrong to the king, but to all men everywhere. Because what will happen, they mused, if women start just doing whatever they want instead of what their husbands want them to do? Chaos and calamity! So the king did what kings do, which was issue a royal decree. And this said that Vashti was no longer going to be the queen. They were going to look for a new queen, and it was just going to be the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. Enter Esther. So Esther was an orphan and also a Jew. She was being raised by her uncle Mordecai, and Esther, turns out, was very beautiful. And so when the king's stewards came tromping through the town looking for the most beautiful woman, they found her. And they brought her to the king's palace. And the scripture said she there underwent cosmetic treatments for a period of approximately 1 year, which is like a biblical basis for go to have a spa day, if you ask me. 365 spa days for Esther. And after all those things, she was presented to the king, though her Jewish identity was hidden from him. And the king agreed that she was very beautiful and he liked her very much, and so Esther became the new queen. Now, it was around this time that Mordecai, Esther's uncle, through a serendipitous chain of events, overheard some disgruntled palace employees threatening to assassinate the king. And so he told Esther, who told the king, and everybody was happy. Well, maybe not everybody, but some people were very happy that the king didn't get assassinated. And most of all, the king himself, and Mordecai was honored by everyone in the court for saving the king's life, which created good vibes for everybody, except for a guy named Haman. This was the king's closest advisor, a really powerful dude, and also apparently pretty arrogant. Haman was accustomed to everyone around him bowing as he passed by, which just seems like such a huge waste of time to me, like interrupting the workflow, but that's neither here nor there. One day, Haman was out walking near the palace gate, and he noticed that when he passed by, Mordecai did not bow down. This is because Mordecai was a Jew and had made a commitment only to bow before God, but that was not a good enough excuse for Haman. And so he did what many violent and powerful people do when they feel threatened. He retaliated. His plot was even more sinister than just payback to Mordecai. His intention was to eliminate all the Jews living in Persia at that time. And so without the king's knowledge, he sent a decree to all the towns and villages in the entire kingdom saying, hey, y'all, on this particular day, at this particular time, rise up and strike down all the Jews. And Mordecai learned about this. And of course, he was deeply distressed. He sent a message to Esther through the palace guard, help us. But as we heard Amy read, Esther wasn't sure this was such a good idea. She had 3 reasons she didn't think this was a great idea. The first was because it was not socially acceptable to just go talk to the king about whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted. You had to be summoned. And going unsummoned had some serious consequences. You could be killed. The second reason was that Esther thought criticizing the king's closest friend and advisor was kind of a risky enterprise. Surely they had loyalty to each other, and such an accusation would be received badly. The third reason is probably the most important one, at least to my reading of it. Remember, the king did not know that Esther was a Jew. And so telling him, hey, there's this terrible plot to murder my people, the Jews, can you help, would be exposing Esther as a Jew, which would also have consequences. She was in the closet, and coming out would be dangerous for her. So she sent all this in a message to Mordecai, and he sent her a response which was this: perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this, which is the one line from Esther people tend to actually know, for just such a time as this. And that must have been very convincing, because Esther decided that Mordecai was right and she was going to go in and see the king. And so she had everybody fast and pray to give her a good sort of vibes going into this meeting. And she went in and she said, "Oh, king, help me. There's a huge plot afoot to kill my people and I need your help." No, that's not what she said. She played it cool. She said, "Why don't you come over to my palace and I'll cook you some dinner?" All right? That's a great place to begin, by the way. Any negotiations, right? Here's some food. It's like a biblical rationale for tables for 8. So he says, yes. We're supporting all of the stuff that's happening here. He said, "Yes, I'll come over like next week or something like that." But in the meantime, unfortunately, he got insomnia. Anybody struggle with insomnia? So the king, here's the solution. He summoned someone to his bedside to read aloud the court records. Okay, so that would be like our clerk coming to your house at 3 in the morning and reading our session minutes to you until you fell asleep. Maybe that's something that we should offer. Ryan's not here. Maybe he knew I was going to say that. So back to the king. He can't sleep. They're reading the records. And they come across the part where it records that Mordecai saved the king from being assassinated. And the king's like, "Oh, that was such a great time." And so the king says to Haman, "Hey, I've decided I really want to honor someone. What do you think I should do?" And Haman assumes it's himself the king wants to honor. And so he starts rattling off like his wish list. He's like, that person should certainly have some new clothes and a new ride and a horse and a chauffeur and kind of like a parade. And the king says, "Awesome. If you could just get all that stuff together and give it to Mordecai, that would be great." At which point Haman goes home, freaks out, yells at his wife, and then builds a gallows in his backyard. This is serious. Okay, yikes. So the next day, it's Esther's banquet. While they're moving down, mowing down, they're all eating, she finds the perfect opportunity and she says, "King, I have to tell you something. I have to tell you that somebody has sold out my people, that I'm deeply troubled. And then I should not only be troubled, you should be troubled too. You're about to lose all of these amazing, faithful, and loyal subjects." And the king is just taken aback. He says, "Who has done this?" And Esther says, "Haman." And now it's the king who gets really angry, because he apparently liked Esther a lot and thought she was very beautiful. And so the king orders that Haman be hung on the gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king sends another decree, which is so long I'm not even going to tell you about it, but summarizing it basically, ignore that other message you got from Haman. Actually, let's make this a national day of celebrating the Jews that are part of our community. And there was great rejoicing, especially among the Jews, some of whom took the opportunity to go and murder all the people that had intended to murder them. And so there was some senseless violence there at the end, but it really ends with a celebration of this day of delivery, during which Mordecai gets pretty drunk and dances around a lot. I'm just telling you what's in here. I'm summarizing it. And that becomes a central feast day for the modern Jewish faith, which is the festival of Purim. Has anybody ever heard of Purim? Purim, on which there are only a few requirements by the Talmud. 1, that you have a drink, and 2, that you dance around a lot. You must do those things to remain a faithful Jew on Purim. So that's Esther. That's the story of Esther. I really love this story. It's got so many elements. Again, like all, it has very wonderful, encouraging elements, has problematic things about violence, misogyny, etc. I'm not going to go do a whole long thing here trying to tell you what to make of it, because sometimes that ruins a good story. But I will say, I think this is a great story for Pride Month. Because I think essentially it's about someone whose full identity cannot be made known or cannot be brought forth, right? All of who Esther is cannot be part of her role as queen. And I know those parallels don't work completely, but I do think there's something there. Esther has to be brave to be herself, to be proud of her identity. So I think it's a story about that. But I also think it's a story about a community who needs that person to be themselves in order to thrive. And I like just to think about that as it relates to our affirming our LGBTQI siblings, because I think we often tend to think of their inclusion as a concession or as a gift to them. Like, oh, okay, we'll include you. You see the same dynamic in a lot of conversations about race, too. Like, sure, we'll include you as a help to you. But really what so much of the biblical witness confirms is that the community cannot be whole, that the community cannot be healthy, the community cannot thrive if anyone in the community is required to live in secrecy or shame or oppression. I think the message is that we need people to be their whole healthy selves because it will save all of us, not just that person. Of course, that's not a message to any particular subgroup. It's a message to everyone. And the call in response to that is the same. To be brave Esthers. And at the same time, to be Mordecais to other Esthers. Saying to one another, or even sometimes to ourselves, you were made for this. You have dignity. You are loved. You deserve to walk with your head held high. You being you is exactly what this moment requires. I think it's also a reminder of how important it is to celebrate our victories around those affirmations, to celebrate the joyful times, to celebrate the mountaintops, and to recognize how far we've come because our joy will fill us for the journey. So that's the end of our story time today. We can put out the fire. I hope you've enjoyed going on this journey with Esther. You can tune in next week for our friend Tobit and his dog. That's not familiar to you. You better make it to church on time. But I think now it would be appropriate to just respond in song. This is another one from our collection.